Hi everybody, welcome to week 4, I think. We are on to our first set of readings that actually sort of take a content approach where we're going to be thinking about essentially the cultural heritage of our current educational system. So you have 2 readings this week, one from Michel Montaigne from the 16th century, the Renaissance, and then one 200 years later by Mary Wollstonecraft, who is a British intellectual and part of the Enlightenment. So what I want to do is give you a brief sort of shotgun set of historical context kind of information for you so that you can place what it is that you're reading. In terms of Montaigne, one of the things that we want to think about is, again, the fact that he's coming out of the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is, of course, this era and this age that is itself indebted to new ways of thinking or essentially a return to the classical eras. And in that, trying to imagine what it is and what it means to be an educated intellectual and a contributor in society. And one of the interesting things about Montaigne is that he is educated in what we now call a traditional humanist style after that of his father, and in fact he went through a kind of educational experiment. As a young child he was raised exclusively on Latin and not on his native French, and then eventually transitioned to French. So that's just kind of an interesting fun fact. But in other words, to sort of back up, he's born in 1533, and then about 35 years later, in 1570, he undergoes a kind of turning point, a near-death experience where he falls off a horse. And we see this sort of shift from trying to kind of engage in public life and leading the sort of typical life of an intellectual to more of a kind of self-inquisitiveness. And so you're going to sort of situate yourself in that era, because Montaigne essentially retreats into the countryside, into his chateau, creates a library, and just starts reading and writing. And in 1572, he starts writing his famous essays. And the thing to know about these essays is they do really mark the first time we encounter this genre. Prose length, longer prose, or we think of as essay, did exist earlier, but this idea of the essay, or the focused kind of exploration of one topic or one set of ideas, is really Montaigne's invention. And one of the many things that makes him unique is that the nature of this writing, and I think you'll sense this, is that it's actually not terribly structured. I mean, there is a sense of structure, but it's almost a little meandering, and there's a sense of his sort of personal, the personal side of him in it. He's very inquisitive. In some ways, he's even sensitive, but he does also have, some of the trappings of the typical intellectual or scholar. He's citing classical sources. He's sort of demonstrating that he knows these kinds of things. And so this is helpful for us to know when thinking about his essay on education, because you'll see those elements as he explores what makes a good education, and he even sort of reflects on his own experience being taught and what worked and what didn't work for him. Another fun fact, those of you who know French may know that in French, to essayer means to try or to probe. And so you could think about the relationship between the name of that genre and what it actually means. So the idea of an essay as a textual form of trial or exploration is important to think about. One of the things I wanted to do to sort of help situate a little bit more, and this is part of your reading, is to look at the section on to the reader that you have in your text. And there, one of the interesting things that Montaigne does here is he says, "This reader is an honest book. It warns you at the outset that my sole purpose in writing in it has been a private and domestic one." And so that's kind of an interesting claim, that this book is supposed to be private, yet it's being published and sent out there. And he sort of extends this metaphor of the book as almost part of him, or a body, or an extension of him. And so again, you sense that sort of personal relationship that he has to these ideas and to the writings that he's putting out there. "I am myself the substance of my book," he says famously in this section. So shifting ahead 200 or so years to Mary Wollstonecraft, what we're getting here is not only a new era, the Enlightenment, but we're also getting the perspective of a female writer. And so a couple of important things to think about. Wollstonecraft's book comes out in 1792, and it actually, as I've mentioned, as a part of the Enlightenment, is responding to a couple of things. One, of course, is the sort of strong critique of the aristocracy that's going on. Of course, in the late 18th century, we have, it's, you know, the era of revolution, the revolution in the United States, the French Revolution. There's a lot of sort of shifting sentiment toward what it means to be in power, and the idea of the individual and reason as being the center rather than groupthink, or in particular religion comes to be critiqued. This, of course, starts to open up questions about what individuals can do to better themselves and how they then can contribute to society, particularly with regard to education. So the idea of an education that is accessible to all is something that starts cropping up at this time. But of course, not surprisingly, all does not mean women. And so Wollstonecraft is sort of addressing that and kind of responding to that in her text. And you'll sense some of that. A couple of other things that I think are important to think about. I've already mentioned the revolutions that have gone on in France and in the U.S. and also in Haiti and other areas, but in particular in France and the U.S. And because of that sense of revolution, that sense of wanting to change existing structures of power, you can see how that sort of creates a space for women and also later slaves, so the abolition movement begins, to start to imagine, well, what does real independence mean? What does it mean for all people to be able to be created equal? You'll see in Wollstonecraft's text, in the sections that I'm having you read, that she begins with a kind of dedication and or response to Talleyrand. And Talleyrand, of course, had published famously a kind of treatise or sort of call for education to be revised and to be accessible to all, but dictated in that women should receive a domestic education. So Wollstonecraft is sort of responding to that in a kind of critical way and arguing very much against it. So that leaves us with thinking about essentially that she is writing in an era and in an atmosphere where there are a tremendous amount of text being circulated on the idea of liberty, independence, and equality, and this is the sort of moment that she's thinking and writing within. So as a way to kind of get you to think a little bit more specifically in terms of your reading, I'm going to read to you a little bit from page 7, and you can, again, go back and look at this video later, or you can look at it right now with me. But towards the bottom of page 7, in the introduction, she says, "One cause of this barren blooming I attribute," and by barren blooming, the sort of lack of a fostering of women and their minds, "One cause of this barren blooming I attribute to a false system of education, gathered from the books written on this subject by men who, considering females rather as women than human creatures, have been more anxious to make them alluring mistresses than affectionate wives and rational mothers." So here, she's criticizing the tendency for women to be valued as mistresses, and instead she's offering the importance of affectionate wives and rational mothers. And what's I think important to notice there is that she's making a case for the importance of educating women. She's still sort of